All right, so my presentation is called Escaping Bondage or Embracing It, and it's an exploration of sexual transgression in contemporary Jewish women's erotica. I know I just threw a lot at you in the first 5 seconds of me talking. I promise I can explain it all. Before I get there, I just want to tell you a little bit about me and where I'm coming from in making this project. So I am a rising junior at Brandeis University. My major is Near Eastern and Judaic Studies, and my minors are History and Sexuality and Queer Studies. So me doing a project about Jewish sexuality is very in character. Nobody was surprised that this was my project, I would say. I also come from a place of a lot of sex positivity. So I work for the Student Sexuality Information Service on campus, which isn't affiliated with this project, but does speak to where I'm coming from. I also work for an organization called Jewrotica.org that puts up Jewish erotica online. So I definitely come from a place of sex positivity, and I feel very strongly about that, and that talking about it is a good thing, and I know that that comes out in my project, so I just wanted to let everyone know that before we start. All right, so if this decides to go, which it's on, hello. There we go.
I can switch it for you if that thing's not working.
We'll see if it works next time. So this was the big tagline that I presented you guys with earlier. That's a little bit scary, so I just want to go through it and talk a little bit about each word, and I'm actually going to start at the end. So erotica. Erotica is a genre of fiction that is erotic or sexual in some way, and it's all the erotica that I looked at in mine is short stories. There are also erotic poems, there are erotic novels, there's erotic video, but I was looking at erotic short stories. Also, when thinking about erotica, it was really important for me to think about what was erotic. So to use the term, to talk about the term erotic, I used a lot of Audre Lorde, who is a poet from the 70s, and she writes about the erotic as a source of power and information, and she also puts it in a very binary setting. She talks about it as the opposite of sexual or pornographic. So the sexual or the pornographic is all about sensation, whereas the erotic is much more internal. It's about feeling, and it promotes this idea of joy on a very deep level. And she would connect that erotic with feminine and the pornographic with masculine, and argue that heterosexist society seeks to suppress the erotic and suppress women. So that was something that definitely influenced my reading of these. So we're going to talk about that a few more times, so just so you guys understand that binary. In terms of contemporary, I was looking at all erotica that was published in the last 30 years. The stories I ended up analyzing were published in 98 and 99, so about 20 years ago. When I say Jewish women's erotica, it's erotica that's written by women, or people who identify as women, and it's written specifically as Jewish erotica. So both of the books that I used say Jewish women erotica on the covers. And that was important to me because I wanted them not just to be erotica that's published by Jews, but also specifically Jewish in some other way, in a way that the author wanted it to be. And then we get to the big word. If you guys were in my internship, you've heard me say this word. What is it?
Transgression.
Transgression. Let's go. So transgression is to cross the boundary of what is acceptable, either by law or by societal judgment. So it's very similar to what Ali was talking about with the boundaries, but I'm talking about crossing those boundaries. And that can be either breaking a law, a Jewish law, an American law, or it can be breaking something that's a taboo, which are two different things. And how we learn what is acceptable is really from our heterosexist society structures. I read Stan Goff, who is a psychologist, I believe, or an anthropologist, I'm not quite sure. Sorry, I'm blanking, that's fine. And he talks a lot about sexuality as being implicitly transgressive regardless, because you're literally transgressing the boundary between inside and outside. Very clear. And he talks about the idea of disgust with anything that goes into and out of the body. and argues that is a large, and he argues that sexuality is thus in some way humiliating for women, which has its own, there's a lot in there, but that's kind of his argument. And he also talks about sexual transgression as sexual and not as erotic, in the way that Audre Lorde would have described it. And then I say sexual transgression because there's a lot of different ways that you can transgress. There's a lot of different rules you can break, but I was really only looking at sexual transgression in these Jewish erotica pieces. Make sense? All right. So there were 3 categories that I came up with for types of sexual transgression in these Jewish erotic stories. And it was basically what you're transgressing against. The first one was Jewish law. We're going to hear a lot about what Jewish law has to say a little bit later from Ariella, I believe. But just to give you guys a little bit, Judaism talks a lot about sex. One of the first requirements in the Bible, or one of the first commandments in the Bible, is to be fruitful and multiply. In order to do that, you have to have sex. Kind of a requirement. But there's also a lot of rules. And a lot of those rules kind of contradict each other or aren't quite clear, and it's kind of confusing. There are some very basic prohibitions that you're just not allowed to do. You're not allowed to adulter. You're not allowed to have incestuous relationships. There's no bestiality, and there's no rape or seduction. What that means is a whole other thing, but yeah. So sex basically should be happening in the context of a married, monogamous, heterosexual relationship. There are 3 specific laws that rules of Judaism that I want to talk about just because they have to do with the 3 stories that I'm about to talk about. The first is sex on Shabbat. Sex on Shabbat in the Second Temple period wasn't allowed, but now is allowed. In the Babylonian Talmud, it also talks a lot about having sex on Shabbat. And there's this idea of double mitzvah, that if you have sex and it's a mitzvah, if you have sex on Shabbat, it's double mitzvah. It's even better. So have sex on Shabbat. That's a good thing. The second one is sex with non-Jews. And since sex should be happening in the context of a monogamous relationship, according to most Judaism rules, I talked about it in the context of intermarriage. And intermarriage, laws against intermarriage date all the way back to the Bible. Again, it says, do not intermarry with them, do not give your daughters to their sons, or take their daughters for your sons, for they will turn your children away from following me to serve other gods, and the Lord's anger will burn against you and will quickly destroy you. So pretty clearly, do not intermarry. That has continued on. There's a whole bunch of discourse right now about intermarriage, but in general, it's thought of as not so great by Jewish law. And then in terms of gay and lesbian sex or homosexual sex, it's actually different for gay and lesbian sex. Gay sex is not allowed. It says you can't lie with another man. There's a whole bunch of discourse. Liberal Judaism has kind of done away with that rule in a lot of ways, but it is against Jewish law. Lesbian sex is a different issue because there's not an issue of spilling seed. So since that's not an issue, it's not quite as much of an offense. Maimonides wrote that for women to play around with one another is forbidden, but though such conduct is forbidden, it is not punishable by lashing, since there's no specific prohibition against it, and in any case, no sexual intercourse has taken place at all. Okay, Maimonides. We're not going to get into a conversation about Maimonides, but so that you guys have some sense of that. The second category of sexual transgression that I came up with was Jewish culture, which is different than Jewish law. Not all Jews adhere to Jewish law, not all Jews adhere to the same Jewish law, and there's also a lot of Jewish cultures, so I'm talking about the American Jewish culture that these works that I'm looking at came out of. If you're thinking about what you think is transgressive in Jewish culture, think about what you wouldn't want to tell your bubby. Like what that would not be acceptable. Hopefully my bubby will still let me drive her home at the end of this presentation. Fingers crossed. Not to single you out. I actually wrote that before I knew that you were going to be here. So, sorry. And then under Jewish culture also comes the ideas that American culture as a whole has about Jews. So that's the Jewish American princess and Jewish mother are the 2 biggest stereotypes for Jewish women in American literature. We're going to hear, I think, about that later from Samantha as well. But basic idea is that the Jewish American princess is usually portrayed as very self-absorbed, very interested in money, not so interested in sex, but very sexually appealing. And the Jewish mother is older, is a mother, wants to feed you, is probably a little overbearing, kind of a helicopter mother. So those are those stereotypes that we're going to talk about. And then the third kind of transgression that I wrote about was transgression against American culture, because these people are in American culture. And when I talk about transgression in American culture, we're really talking about white Anglo-Saxon Protestant culture, because that is the normative culture in the United States. And I also want to say that I'm talking about American culture, not about American laws. That's because the biggest example of that is adultery. So adultery is not against the law in America, but it is definitely still taboo. So adultery would be a transgression of American culture, even though it's not a transgression of American law. And the biggest things that I'm looking at in terms of transgressions of American culture are sadomasochism and power exchange in sex. So that you guys know what that is, in case anybody doesn't. Sadomasochism is enjoying either inflicting or receiving pain, and power exchange is when one person or the other has that unilateral ability to transgress boundaries. So we're going to talk about that. I'm probably going to refer to it as SM or power exchange, just so that you guys know what that is. All right, you might be like, okay, that's all well and good, Lily, but where's the proof? Here's the proof. So I used 2 different books. I used Friday the Rabbi Wore Lace, which is all lesbian erotica, and I used The Oi of Sex, which is a mix. So I'm going to hand these to you guys. You guys are welcome to pass them around and look at them while I talk about the stories. But here we go. So the first story that I analyzed was Shayna's Shabbat by Cloudy Taupin. Shayna's Shabbat is about a woman named Shayna and her husband Abram having sex on Shabbat. And it starts with her peeking. She makes dinner, she takes a shower, Abram comes home, they have sex, he spanks her, so there is a little bit of SM involved, and then they go on and have Shabbat dinner. So we're going to analyze it through our three different types of transgression. And here's what I came up with. Jewish law, they're having sex on Shabbat, they're married, they're heterosexual, there's not a whole lot to talk about there. Jewish culture, I also didn't find it, I wrote about it a little bit in my paper, but there's nothing that's worth reporting in this 20-minute presentation. In terms of American culture, there's definitely some power play involved. She says, he spanks her, but in the end, it really seems like it's very much performative. She asks him to spank her before he does. When she says, like, oh, I need to come now, he obliges her. There's no actual power exchange happening. It's very much performative. So that's what I ended up arguing with Shayna's Shabbat. The second one, and I also argued that it was sexual and not erotic, because the entire story was very much focused on the physical acts, and it didn't really talk about the emotions, and it also was very focused on that SM type of performance. All right, the second story I talked about was Catholic Boys by Harvest Garfinkel. This is about a woman whose name I'm forgetting. Nancy, it's Nancy. So Nancy is talking with her friend Diana, and she's telling her friend Diana how she's always been attracted to Catholic men, and Diana, who's also Jewish, doesn't quite get it. So then Nancy, who's a gynecologist, goes back to her gynecology office, and the custodian who's cleaning up in there is named Tom, and he's this tall, blonde, Polish man with tattoos going down his arms and a cross necklace, and she's like, oh my goodness. She's very into it. She comes on to him, essentially, she's like, oh, did that tattoo hurt? They go back to her house and they have some very power exchange sex where he is dominant and she is submissive. So that's that story. Here we go with the analysis. There's more on this one. So in terms of Jewish law, the fact that he's Catholic and she's Jewish is a transgression. And she talks about it, it's very explicitly named. She says that she likes Catholic men because they were different. You could never know them. That's how she explains it to Diane. Also, we come to the predictable moment where she sees his penis and it is not circumcised. It says he hadn't been cut, another forbidden thrill for Nancy, and his foreskin was so long that there was a short turtleneck around a smooth head. So there's clearly a focus on what is different. She also talks a lot about his tattoos, which aren't allowed by Jewish law. So that's Jewish law. In terms of Jewish culture, I looked at that with the stereotypes that I was talking about earlier. In terms of the Jewish American princess stereotype, she does not conform to the Jewish American princess stereotype. She is a doctor, so she has education, which is not within that stereotype. Also, she treats women without insurance, which points the focus away from money. In terms of the Jewish mother stereotype, it does say that, so the story is in third person, so we hear a little bit about Tom's thoughts as well. And Tom thinks about his mother for a moment while they're like getting down and dirty. So that is definitely a little bit iffy. And in some ways she conforms because she does end up feeding him at the end, but she doesn't lose her sexuality. She doesn't become desexualized, and so in that way she doesn't conform. And in terms of American culture, she submits to Tom. She says, you own me, I'm here to serve you, and he reminds her to call him sir. However, there's a little bit of confusion here with who is active and who's passive. That's because at the beginning, she's really the one coming on to him. She at one point even says, wow, you submit nicely, but that's before this switch. So there is some confusion there with active and passive. I ultimately came to the conclusion that this one as well was sexual over erotic, and I came to that because it was, again, so focused on like the physicality. He talks a lot about his penis. He talks about like her Jewish curls, and then there is this huge power exchange happening. The third story that I talked about that I'm going to rush through a little bit just because I want to get to the main conclusions is A Religious Experience by Leslie and Newman. It's about two women named Lori and Melinda. Lori is much more butch, which means she presents and acts in a more masculine way even though she's a woman. And Melinda is more femme, which means she presents and dresses in a more feminine way. And they are lesbians and they live together. They've been dating for a while. It says like 3 years, I believe, in the story. And Melinda, who's the femme, is also much more religious. And the story takes place on Yom Kippur, so it starts with her getting ready for Yom Kippur. She goes out to Yom Kippur services, and Lori is like, what? So Lori talks a lot about how she is Jewish, but she also says, if my being Jewish makes Melinda happy, then it makes me happy. She has no interest in going to services, and she doesn't really understand the not having sex on Yom Kippur thing at all. And so the story is about Lori masturbating on Yom Kippur, and then Melinda coming home and them having sex. So that's the story. Analysis, we're going to rush through it. I know there's a lot in here. So in terms of Jewish law, they're transgressing the rules about being lesbian. Obviously, Lori doesn't care so much because she doesn't seem to really care about being Jewish, so I'm not sure how much of a transgression that is for her. And it actually doesn't appear to be a transgression for Melinda either. She invites Lori, she really tries to get Lori to come to her shul with her, to come to Yom Kippur services, which points to a problem with this Jewish law and Jewish culture. She's going to transgress one or the other, it seems like. And then in terms of Jewish law and Yom Kippur, Lori just really can't understand why they wouldn't have sex on Yom Kippur. And so there's this whole discourse about that. It turns out that's actually a pretty common thing. I read an article about Jews in Israel having sex on Yom Kippur as a very exciting thing. And then there's also this whole gender transgression with the butch and the femme thing. I'm going to skip over it just because I want to get to my conclusions and I only have a minute left. I'm so sorry, guys. I'd like to talk. So performativity of transgression, I talked about how it is possible to perform transgression. However, nobody can really see it. So like, what is performance? It gets a little bit funky. But ultimately, even when they're not being transgressive, they need to have that transgression in order to aid the eroticism or the sexuality of the moment. And so then I thought about the transgressive as innately erotic. So the act of transgressing is erotic. It's not necessarily the act itself that's erotic, and it also happens to be transgressive. And I also talked about the transgression aiding the erotic over the sexual. I came to the conclusion in the end that a religious experience was the only erotic one, and that it was the most transgressive, that I wasn't able to really quite, I'm so sorry, I'm out of time. And then I wrote a lot about Jewish guilt. There's a lot of rules, you have to follow a whole bunch of rules, some of them conflict, leads to Jewish guilt. That's where I'm gonna end, thank you. I'm sorry, that ends. Questions? Yes.
Do you see the image of the Jewish American princess changing at all over time? Like, one thing I was struck by was you said that getting a lot of secular education is not part of the Jap image. And
I would say
that
that's
was surprising to me because actually Jewish women have actually always, going back to the 19-teens, gotten more secular education than any other ethno-religious group. And especially now, the level of professionalism among Jewish women is staggering. So
absolutely.
Is that in fact a part of the Jap?
So what I meant when I said that wasn't secular education specifically, it was more just like drive and ambition. I would say that ambition is not part of the Jap idea. Maybe I'm misunderstanding that. And I did very minimal reading about it, so I will acknowledge that I'm not an expert readily. I would say that the Jap stereotype, as I understand it, tends to be much more self-centered, and I think would probably not conform to the idea of, because the quote is that here, we can go back to it. I've always treated a percentage of women who don't have insurance, and you don't get rich that way. So she's saying that she's become a gynecologist, but she also treats people from insurance, and so I think that shifted focus is more what I was addressing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, we could talk about it. I think it's perhaps more complicated.
Okay. Thank you.
I'm curious about the whole genre of Jewish erotica. You've got 2 books here. I'm curious if there is a lot of Jewish erotica out there. And also, I'm just curious whether you would argue just by reading Jewish erotica is a transgressive act.
So I wrote a little bit about it. In terms of the genre of Jewish erotica, there is more published Jewish erotica. There's also erotica that's published by Jewish authors that has some Jewish undertones, but isn't published specifically as Jewish erotica. So then there's a question of whether or not that falls under Jewish erotica. The question of what Jewish erotica even is very complicated. There's definitely other books that are published, especially, and there are also books that have been published more recently than 1999. But there's also a lot of stuff just online. So Jewrotica.org doesn't count as published, but there's a whole bunch of stories up on there. There's stuff that people have just put on a blog or on something else. So there definitely is, there's really no scholarship though on it at all, at least in English. And the second part of your question.
It is the reading of.
Right, so I actually wrote a little bit in my paper about how the writing of erotica is in some way transgressive, but I also wrote about the fact that of these 3 stories, 2 of them are fake names. 2 of the authors, when I Googled them, nothing came up, which means that they were pen names. And when I went into the about the author section, there really wasn't a lot in there. So I think that also points to the idea of you can write this transgressive erotica, or you can write this Jewish erotica that has themes of transgression, or that doesn't so much, but you still don't want to put your name on it, which means that it is taboo in some way, that it is transgressive. So I would say definitely writing it is, and I think if writing it is, reading probably is as well. Yeah.
I noticed that the only story you named as erotic was the story with the 2 women, the lesbian story. And I'm curious if you think that the role of it being two women is what makes it more erotic. Like to you, like you as a scholar reading it, like approaching it, do you think that is like I was curious how your own biases like influence that reading. If that makes sense.
So I ultimately came to that conclusion a lot because of this gender transgression and this idea of penetrating and penetrator. So when Lori, who's the butch character, is masturbating, she talks about imagining that her body is Melinda's body, and she ends up fingering herself, which is something that she says she's never done before. She says it seems too much a femme thing to let someone in like that. And she's already being, so she's like transgressing the transgressive role that she's put herself in, if that makes sense. And I think in a lot of ways that double transgression is really an issue for her, and it's something that she wrestles with a lot in the story. I'm happy to lend you the story as well if you want to read it. But I think that double transgression like almost strips away like the physical sexual part of it. She's not so much thinking about the sexual like sensation, if that makes sense. So that was why I came to that conclusion. I will acknowledge that Audre Lorde does say that like lesbian sex is the only actually erotic sex. So that is probably also flavoring this as well. Anyone else? Yeah.
You might not have the answer, but this seems to be an American exploration. Do you have a sense if we were looking at the same questions in Israel or elsewhere?
I don't. So I wasn't able to find anything about any Jewish erotica, contemporary Jewish erotica. If there was scholarship about it in Hebrew, it would probably be written in Hebrew, which would mean I can't read it. And so I didn't even look at Hebrew articles like to translate even like the abstract. So I'm not sure. Yes.
How did you end up selecting the 3 stories that you focused on?
So I read through a lot of stories, lots and lots. And I was looking for stories that transgressed in different ways. So I wanted to find a story that was not like outwardly transgressive, because I felt like it was important to establish a baseline. So that's how I chose Shayna Shabbat. And then Catholic Boys, I wanted to talk about sex with a non-Jew, and I also wanted to talk about this power exchange. And this story just happened to combine it in a way that made it easy to write about. And then I wanted to write about something that was homoerotic, just because I think it would be missing a large part of what Jewish erotica is, if we were to exclude the lesbian part of it. And this would, and I really liked this book, but I didn't like all the stories in it. So I chose this one because it was the length that I needed it to be. A lot of the stories in her book were like twice as long as this, and that was going to be too much for my paper. Cool, thank you.